Presence of adult children, a source of stress for elderly couples' marriages, by J. Jill Suter and Carl Pillemer. So basically, in this article, they start talking about how over the past few decades, there's been a very large amount of research that has been directed towards understanding and focusing on how the presence of a young child affects their parents' marital relationship. They say that in general, these studies have reported that the presence of a child tends to have a detrimental effect on the quality of the parents' marriages. He then says that much less is known, however, about the effects of the presence of an adult child on elderly parents' marital relations. He says that this issue has largely been neglected in previous research, probably because of the assumption that older couples' children will no longer be part of the household. He says that, however, although there might be this assumption, that there shouldn't be, because there's actually a very large amount of adult children co-residing in the parental home when their parents are already considered elderly parents. And because there's such an increase in this number, there's need for research on it. He says that family scholars have recently begun to take an interest in the effects of residence sharing on family relations, but that there have still but that despite this, there's still very few empirical investigations on this phenomenon of adult children co-residing in the parental home of elderly parents, and how that itself affects the marriage of those parents. He says that the purpose of his study is to extend the investigation of family relations when adult children and their parents live together. He says that marital relations on the study have received surprisingly little attention, considering the dramatic increase in research on older parents in recent years. He says that there is research that exists on the subject that generally paints an encouraging picture, particularly by comparing with the middle-aged and their counterparts. So basically, what he means by that is that the research out there, there's very little talking about this subject and marriage, and the one that is out there is focusing on middle-aged parents rather than elderly parents. He says that the presence of children in the home, the few researchers who have studied marriage within the context of co-residency of the child and the parent, they have found that the presence of the child in the home has tended to reduce couples' marital interaction and marital satisfaction and all that. He says that the literature on marriage in the later years suggests that these potentially damaging patterns are often reversed at the time when children leave the parental home. So basically, meaning that research has found that basically the reverse that he's talking about is the emptiness when the child is leaving, and when the nest is empty and it's just the parents, how this has been considered a time of like rekindling for the marriage. But when the child returns or never leaves, they don't get that period of rekindling of the marriage, or they lose that period of rekindling of the marriage. And that is what has tended to cause, or what researchers are finding is causing the marital dissatisfaction and marital issues within with the co-residency. He says that in addition to examining whether the mere presence of adult children affects the marital conflict, that it's also important to investigate the specific conditions under which living with an adult child affects parents' relationships. And he says that then he goes on to talk about how he will do this, and this is his methods. He says that the data in this study was collected between September 1985 and February 1986 in the Boston metropolitan area as part of a larger study of the family relations of the elderly. He says that in this study, a random sample was drawn of people 65 years of age and older listed in the 1985 published town list, and that once these elders were selected were identified, they were classified on the basis of their living arrangement. So, for example, if they lived alone or lived with a spouse or lived with an adult child, or etc. So then they took their living arrangements and they drew them up, and that's how they got their samples. So the samples are drawn from each of these categories, and oversampling for persons living with spouses and or adult children. And this procedure resulted in a final eligible amount of 2,813 people who were living with a spouse and with an adult child. And 72 of that amount were part of the study. So in this particular study, they analyzed from that 2,813 people, they analyzed 677 of those people who were married and lived with their spouses at the time of the study, and who had at least one living child 18 years of age or older in the home. Most of the data in this study was gathered through telephone interviews that lasted about 30 to 45 minutes and covered topics such as the respondents' physical health, ability to perform activities of daily living, family interaction, family conflict, abuse, and satisfaction with the relationship with both the family members and friends and the marriage. And that's basically what they would ask, and that's basically what they talked about in these interviews, and that's how they gathered their information. So now onto the results. So I'm just going to talk about the major findings because it's the major things that the studies are talking about. And basically the main finding and the most actually very surprising finding of this article was that sharing a residence with an adult child didn't seem to show in this study marital conflict amongst the elderly parent. So basically, respondents who shared a residence with an adult child experienced no greater conflict within their marriage than respondents who didn't share a home with an adult child. And this finding was particularly surprising in the light of the previous research and literature that showed a decline in marital quality when younger couples became parents, and an increase when parents completed the launching stage. They also found that in this study, they also found that the presence of an adult child didn't play as an important role as they had previously thought, based on other research in the well-being of the elderly, as once was thought due to previous research. That didn't really make sense, but basically what I'm saying is that they found that what they had previously thought, they had previously thought because of other previous research and because of like what other researchers were finding in their studies, that the presence of the child would lead to a lowering in the well-being of the elderly. But turns out this wasn't really like proved or supported with the evidence in this data. They actually didn't find anything to support it. These findings called into question the conclusions drawn in one of the previous studies, which he mentioned in the literature review. It was Clemens and Axelson's, and this particular study found that middle-aged parents sharing a residence with an adult child. It studied middle-aged parents who shared a residence with an adult child, and they basically found that when having an adult child in the home, it negatively affected the marriage of the midlife parents. But in this study, when they were researching using adult children and elderly parents, they found no difference in the marital happiness or quality or satisfaction. So that's interesting because they're contradicting findings. Also, these findings further reveal that the primary variable explaining marital conflict in residency sharing families is parent-child conflict. And this suggests that the greater effort should be made to understand the factors that affect conflicts between parents and their residents' adult children. So basically, those are the major findings of this study, and he's basically saying how the reason he thinks that the research turned out like this was, well, he doesn't know the reason, but he says that these findings show that and prove how different and varied results can be when researching marriages and families and stuff like that, because there's so many different characteristics that go into a family and a household and all of that. So when trying to examine different and study them, the results can be very different and complex and varied. And that is basically what he found, that there was no change, which was interesting because in other research there was. So basically that is the major finding of this article.